I killed my dad. At least, I thought I did when I was 10 years old. I was only 10 years old. My dad died unexpectedly from a heart attack in the middle of the night. I'd gotten mad at him, and the last thing I ever said to him was, "I never want to speak to you again." And I didn't. I carried the weight of guilt with me for most of my life. And I also experienced a lot of fear because I realized that life can change just like that. I was a kid going through a lot of difficult emotions. And since that time, I've realized I wasn't the only one. 20% of kids experience the loss of someone important to them. Look down your road. That's every fifth person who's experienced the loss of a parent, grandparent, family member, sibling, and our uncle. Grief has a lot of heavy emotions for kids, just like it does for adults. And when kids are grieving, we can see this manifest in inability to sleep, fear of being alone, or increased irritability and anger. We can also see an increase in mental health disorders and behavioral disorders like ADD and ADHD. We can even see self-harm, suicidal ideations, and an increased involvement with the juvenile justice system. That means going to jail. We can see a direct correlation right now. In New Orleans, a study was done, and 75% of youth have experienced 2 or more violent losses before the age of 5. In Chicago, 90% of detained youth have experienced the loss of someone important to them. I'm a former juvenile defense attorney, and I've worked with grieving children firsthand. When I first sat down with my client, Jake, let's call him that for confidentiality reasons, he was 14 years old, and this wasn't his first interaction with the law. Jake had been questioned as a witness when he saw his father shoot his mother in the head in front of him. In that moment, he lost his father physically and his mother. In that time, Jake had built up all this anger and resentment for his father and the loss and everything that he had been going through. When we sat down, I found out that he had been talking back in school, not paying attention, not doing his work, had recently got involved with a local gang, and had gotten in a pretty big fight, which is why he was sitting in front of me that day. When we were talking, he told me that he had no future, that this was it for him, and that he was going to end up in the criminal justice system for the rest of his life. And I knew that he was right if we didn't fix the root cause of it, that he would cycle in and out. So when I went in front of the judge, instead of time in custody, I asked for time in a grief support organization that helped local kids. Jake began talking to other kids about the emotions associated with grief and releasing that pain that he was feeling. I'm proud to say that Jake did not cycle in and out of the criminal justice system for the rest of his life, and that he does have a future. Unfortunately, he's one of few. Psychologists have stated that delayed and unresolved grief can lead to negative behaviors when kids are teens because they built up all these emotions that they don't understand, and it's kind of like a shaken up soda can that's just waiting to explode. In as early as 1997, a study was done of kids ages 6 to 12, and it showed that when kids had someone sit down and talk with them about their grief, they experienced fewer symptoms of anxiety and withdrawal. It also showed that when you compared these kids to other kids who did not have that same support, and those kids had an important person in their life listening to them grieve, that they had a reduction in negative behaviors at home and at school. So if we know that talking to kids about their grief is so important, why are we so afraid to do it? Are we afraid of our own mortality? Our own losses? Or are we only afraid we're going to make things worse? This isn't the case everywhere. In Mexico, Day of the Dead is a day dedicated to honoring and celebrating loved ones who have died. People come together and connect and share stories about their loved ones that have passed. In Indonesia, Ireland, and South Africa, There are days after a person passes dedicated to connection and community and sharing those stories. I recently heard of a story of a culture that moves things in their yard, in their house when someone passes to let that person in the community know that their life has changed, and so our lives are changing too. Here, instead, I've heard kids be told, "Be strong, don't cry. You're the man of the house now." And I've even heard kids not be told that the person died for fear of how they may react. How can we change this and stop the grief to prison pipeline? First, we can model healthy grieving. I'm a prime example for not healthy grieving. When I was a kid, I threw myself into every activity under the sun to avoid sitting with my emotions. That backfired because when I turned 18, I started having 10 to 15 panic attacks a day. All that fear that I had built up, I was that shaken up soda can that exploded. We can change that by coming together, sharing our emotions, respecting that everyone grieves differently, even if you're in the same family, experiencing the same kind of loss. Share those emotions and validate what other people are feeling when they come to you with their stories. If you're scared to start those conversations, you can start by asking open-ended questions like, how are you feeling? What would you like me to know? What are you going through? And let them respond fully and tell you exactly what they're feeling. You can do this by active listening, not interrupting, paying attention, validating their emotions, summarizing what you've heard. How can we use these techniques to normalize grief and help our children? If you're someone who interacts with kids on a daily basis, a teacher, a mentor, a coach, you can change the grief landscape by asking open-ended questions to these kids and listening to them. If you're someone who never interacts with a child, you can still play an important part by modeling healthy grieving. Together, we can start normalizing grief. The future of our kids depends on it.